Welcome, sir. Good to see you again.
Thank you. Mr. Mayor and lady and council people, my name is Stephen Ferrandi, and I come before you today not as a real estate broker, although I'm the director of land brokerage with KLNV, but as an educator. So on the faculty at Johns Hopkins University, I teach real estate there, and I'm also a faculty of several other real estate schools. So what I wanted to do was explain from my perspective what it really means when someone talks about a mixed-use development as opposed to a multiple-use development or a residential subdivision or an office building project, etc. So with that stated, if we can turn to the slides. So a mixed-use development needs a minimum of 3 revenue-producing uses. Residential is typical, but with that is either manufacturing, entertainment, a combination of community, cultural, or religious, office, hotel, retail, and parking. An early example of mixed use is a medieval village. And I know that sounds kind of strange, but let's incorporate this and understand why I'm saying this. A medieval village is a perfect example of a functional, productive community incorporating all of the rules of mixed use. So if you look at the medieval village, one, it's concise. It's contained within a very limited number of acres. A medieval village was typically located on a hill protected by walls. The smaller the circumference of walls, the more dense the village. By building all property uses close together, the walls were able to protect the village more securely than if the village was spread out over many hundred acres. So it's the exact opposite of what we would call today sprawl. And here's an example of what we're talking about as a medieval village with ramparts or walls. As the population of a village grew, density was contained within the limitation of the walls until no further growth could be supported. Only then were the walls or the ramparts removed and then built as more acreage was incorporated. The rules for building a medieval village: compactness, density, mixed uses, limited transportation systems. These are the exact same rules for a mixed-use development. The ramparts of Quebec City, the only remaining fortified city walls north of Mexico. Cities sprouted from medieval villages, they adopted many of the principles common to mixed use. As an example, we can see this early rendering of a map from London, a 1728 map of Manhattan, and an 1814 map of Boston. Everything is concise and contained. As populations of early American cities swelled to dangerous levels, local government began to mandate the segregation of uses for health and welfare of its citizens. So here we have a slum in New York in 1890, and at this point in time we have retail and some manufacturing, but more retail on the lower levels, but tenement housing on the upper levels. It was because of this type of use that we decided to incorporate Euclidean zoning. And so zoning was first used as a method for local government to control development. It took place in New York City in 1916. For those that may not know, concept of zoning is local government has the right to regulate how a private property can be developed under the police powers granted to government. The seminal case is Ambler Realty versus the village of Euclid, Ohio. In that case, the village of Euclid, Ohio downzoned a parcel of ground that was owned by Ambler Realty Company from industrial, which the owner had valued at $10,000 per acre, to residential, which was valued at $2,500 an acre. Ambler sued, and in 1926, the Supreme Court validated the village of Euclid, Ohio's concept of zoning. And so that's where Euclidean zoning comes from. After the case was upheld, land use was then segregated into different areas. And so we're starting to see the first concept of that mixed-use idea being broken apart. And so here you have a segregated map showing color codes of different types of zones no longer integrated. 3 or more uses means a larger scale. Though it's possible to develop a small-scale mixed-use project, typical mixed-use projects have to exceed at least 100,000 square feet. A mixed-use project can be even as large as several million square feet. Mixed-use developments must exhibit the following attributes. They can have these, and if they don't have them exactly right, it's a multi-use project, not a mixed-use project. It must be a development that conformed with a coherent plan. So you can't have sprawl and have to start out from the beginning and pretty much end up the same way that it was originally planned. mixed-use component should be significant for for example, more than site-serving amenities. So if you're going to have a hotel there, it has to be a true hotel. It can't be something because there's an airport nearby. It has to be able to sustain itself. The same would be true for restaurants. You want restaurants that are not necessarily going to sustain themselves because of the local population of office users, but people are going to come to that restaurant. And it needs to be pedestrian friendly. You're trying to get people out of the car and walk around from the office component and the entertainment component and the residential component and create a truly simplistic use from a pedestrian standpoint. It's easy to navigate. Examples going back into the 30s is the Cleveland Union Terminal. Now it's called the Tower City property. This was one of the earliest big projects built in Cleveland, Ohio. It consisted of a train station, Harvey Shops and Restaurants, Higbee's department store, an 18-story medical office building, an 18-story Midland building, an 18-story Builders Exchange building, the tallest building in the Midwest, which was the 52-story terminal building, the Hotel Cleveland, and a post office. So that's the building. That's the project. I believe the Hard Rock Cafe came later. Rockefeller Center. Interestingly enough, when the Rockefeller family proposed this, there was not a bank in America that would lend them money. This was entirely built with private funds. There were private funds. Built in 1931, it consists of 19 commercial buildings connected via an underground concourse, i.e. that idea of walkability. It's 8 million square feet on 22 acres. West Edmonton Mall, kind of an extreme example, but over 6 million square feet that's home to 800 stores and services, a cinema, multiplex, nightclubs, an indoor lake with a sea lion habitat, the world's largest indoor water park, an NHL regulation-size ice rink, a hotel, parking for 20,000 vehicles, and a full-size amusement park. I didn't really appreciate this until my fiance, who was actually from Edmonton, explained to me that it gets 40 degrees below zero in Canada during the winter time, and so that's why people go here. And as you can see, it's a city basically under roof. Physical and functional integration. A vertical mixing of project components into a single megastructure, all for occupying a single city block. This is a different type of mixed use, but still considered mixed use. And an example of that would be Baltimore's Renaissance Hotel. It's one large city block, but within that large city block is a 586-room hotel, a 4-story shopping mall, a multi-story office complex, and then the entire Undercroft area is a parking arcade. A different type of mixed use would be the Reston Town Center. Outdoor venue with 50-plus retail shops, 30 restaurants, a multi-screen hotel, pavilion, and then obviously a residential component as well. Again, the most recent local for Prince George's County would be National Harbor, a 300-acre development on the shores of the Potomac River, convention center, 6 hotels, restaurants, outdoor festival area, and then residential condominiums. So all of these are ideas of mixed use, and as you can see, what we're trying to say is that you have more than one use there that's going to attract people at various times a day. People can get out of their cars and walk around, but there's a synergy. So the idea that the hotel does well because there's offices, and you have people that are flying in for that office that'll go to the hotel. The restaurants do well because there's a residential component as well as the office component. Interconnection of the project components through pedestrian-friendly connections, such as sidewalks along streets, interior walkways, enclosed corridors, underground concourses, such as you saw at Rockefeller Center, retail plazas and mall areas, escalators, and bridges between buildings. The whole idea here is it needs to be easy to navigate. Parking is a really important component and one of the things that people don't give enough attention to. It needs to be integrated as a key component in the land use and not thought of as an afterthought. And the big issue here is we're trying to get people out of their cars, but please don't make the mistake of thinking they're not going to have cars. Too many times people think, well, I can get away with a couple of zip cars and I don't necessarily need as many parking spaces. In our society in today's world, we're not giving up our car just because we live in a mixed-use project. We may have the car parked a long time, but we still have a problem of having to deal with a parked car somewhere. Successful mixed use is pedestrian friendly. The second criteria of distinguished mixed use from all other real estate projects is its pedestrian circulation and orientation. How a pedestrian is invited into the space and then is able to freely move from the product type to product type is key to successful mixed use product. My thought is, when you're thinking of this, stop thinking of buildings as buildings and begin thinking of buildings as a community. Why does somebody want to be in that hotel or that residential component? Because it's part of a community and part of a bigger process. Questions to ponder, and this is true whether you're the developer or the planning authority or the lender. Why are you doing a mixed-use project? First question, why not do a segregated project? Why not do just an apartment building or just an office building? Why are you doing it as mixed use? There has to be a good reason for that. Does it make economic sense? It's much, much more expensive to develop as a mixed-use project than it does as a standalone segregated project. Why this location? There's part of the commercial real estate aspect of life is that we deal with something called market analysis. And the market analysis will say this location works better than some other location. You have to answer that question honestly. Why this location? Why will this project be a success? What's the right mix of product types? And what are the negative aspects of this project? And again, that's the question I don't think people ask, but you really have to play devil's advocate on your own project and say, why will this project work? And the other aspect of it is, why would this project fail? Mixed-use development is expensive. For the developer, costs don't go up incrementally when you're doing mixed use. They go exponentially. It's very expensive to do a mixed-use project well. Another tidbit of wisdom is mixed-use projects experience the greatest economic trouble when one of the components is developed at a scale, a quality, or a cost level that requires the other components to subsidize it. Each component has to be able to stand on its own. And the problem that you run into is so often government will tell the developer, you have to have a hotel component when there's no reason to have a hotel component. So they build a hotel component that fails miserably, and consequently all the other components have to try to support it. It's all about the demographics, competing product, the size of the market. How can the developer penetrate a particular market, and why this location? Why mixed-use projects fail? The project was built in an area with insufficient housing density. As somebody who specializes in selling land, so often we hear from residential folks, especially shopping center and grocers, there's just not enough rooftops to justify me being there. That's what they're looking at, is they're looking at housing density. The cost to construct commands rents that the consumer traffic can't support. I'm dealing with an issue right now where one constituent group wants the buildings to be fancier and of a more higher quality building material, and it's an apartment project, and the apartment developer is saying, listen, I'm stuck at $1,800 a month for rent, and the fact that I build something that would command $3,000 a month in rent in D.C. doesn't make me get $3,000 rent at this location. It makes me get $1,800. So I'm limited to what I can command. There are too many competing projects for customer dollars, rent or retail. And then the wrong mixes of uses. Again, that goes back to that market analysis idea. And a final tidbit is you can't force mixed-use development. The property and the market have to be right. If local government mandates percentages, which too often happens, rather than allowing the developer and his team of experts to decide, the project will probably fail miserably. A word of caution would be you're better off working collaboratively with a particular developer and say, we want to see this as a successful project. How as we as a team can come together to make this project work. And by that, you sit down and say, it needs to have 3 or 4 or 5 components, but how many hotel rooms? How many square feet of office or how many square feet of retail? Should it be townhouses as opposed to condominiums? Why does all of that work? And here the developer and his market analysis folks say, as opposed to putting in writing that 20% of it will be this and 30% of it will be that. Thank you. That concludes my presentation. Are there questions?
Well, very informative, and we appreciate it. Particularly like the reference to our medieval village.
Yes.
Well, we do thank you very much. We have questions for our guests. Mrs. Blaine?
Could you please repeat that last sentence you got about a percentage of this and a percent?
Yes, right. So the way that one would build a successful mixed-use project is instead of denoting percentages, a lot of times what local government will do is tell the developer that in order for this project to go forward, 10% of that has to be hotel, 20% has to be office, no more than 40% can be residential. Instead of doing that just by making percentages up, a more successful way would be to work collaboratively, hearing the market analysis argument that he's hired professionals that will say this project will support this much density of this product type or that product type, and then collaboratively work and say why should we have a 500-room hotel as opposed to a 200-room hotel, or why should this project will support 600 apartment units, not 200 apartment units. Work collaboratively.
And I think one last question. The mixed use is different than an EIA in what?
I'm not sure. EIA?
With these employment areas where they have the offices and all
right.
that. So how does it vary?
In a traditional mixed use, you're using one of those 7 components, and you're adding 2 or 3 components, or actually 3 or more components together. You're creating a workable area, you're creating a walkable area, and there is a master plan involved, and everyone is working according to that master plan, so that when it builds out, it's a community. It's a thought-out community.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. Mr. Garner.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I have a question for Mr. Ferrandi.
Yes, sir.
Yes. My question to you is, or for you, is could you provide an example or a location, a name within a local metropolitan area that has failed by misuse?
That has failed?
Yes.
Well, it's not particularly local as far as Prince George's County is concerned, but there's a project in Baltimore County, Maryland called Towson Commons.
Okay.
And Towson Commons failed.
Tell me, why did it fail in your professional opinion?
I still scratch my head because let me paint the picture for those that don't know. It's located in Towson. It's 2 blocks from Towson University. It had first-floor restaurant retail. It had a movie theater. It had a parking garage internal, and it had an office building. And the movie theater failed with 15,000 college kids. The movie theater failed. The restaurants failed. The parking always did well because it's hard to find a parking space in Towson. And the office component did well. And they gutted it, and they're doing something else with that particular building. But on surface, you should imagine that would have worked, especially when you had, I believe it had a TGI Fridays or that type of a retailer, a restaurant in there, and the movie theater. How does the movie theater fail 2 blocks from a college campus? But
absolutely. Now, did that site have any residential component as well?
No residential component there. It's right on the heart of Towson on York Road.
Are they adding residential care?
Across the street, about 2 blocks over, they're adding residential right now. But at the time, they didn't.
So that particular project, do you believe residential would help?
I think residential in the area would have helped, not necessarily on that particular building.
Okay, in the area?
Just in the area. And again, it's an interesting project to look as a case study because it was really geared towards college kids, and you had a university 2 blocks away with all the dorms over there. So you had to house them. I don't know the reason that it failed, but it did fail miserably.
Okay. And tell me, at what point after construction did they realize that they were in trouble? That they had to make a
pretty
change?
quickly. I think probably within the first 2 or 2.5 years, after everything got up and the shine was off the rose, all of a sudden they realized they had a problem.
How old of a complex is this or community is it?
I think the building was active for maybe 8 years, and then ultimately the restaurants closed and the theater closed. The building's still up, but it's really just a parking garage and an office complex. In
your professional opinion, do you see to where this may have contributed, or the economy, the downsides in the economy?
It failed before the economy. It failed before the downsides.
Oh, before the economy?
Yes, sir.
Interesting.
It failed because of the wrong mix. Again, I apologize. I wasn't intimate to the project, but it did fail because of the wrong mix.
Okay, and not the economy.
Right.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Mr. Turner.
Good evening. I appreciate the opportunity to comment. Sorry, I walked in a little bit, but I was fortunate enough to sit in when you gave your presentation before the Economic Development Committee last year, so at least I was somewhat familiar with what you were going to say. I don't think much changed from that presentation. So, and I appreciate your perspective because, in essence, you've given us kind of a roadmap of the do's and don'ts if we go down this road in a particular case here in the city of Bowie that we're considering. Just by way of example, and I'm trying to remember if I asked this question of you when you were before the EDC, I mean, obviously our project is a little bit different because it was established as one particular use many years ago, and now we're considering whether or not to introduce other uses to make it a truly mixed-use project. I'm just curious, what's your experience with other projects kind of coming around for a second bite to say maybe what we originally proposed, hasn't been working, but we're willing to work collaboratively to do something jointly to make it work?
Right. Again, without giving any specific examples, when you have a large site, it takes so long for that site to get built out that markets change, and so consequently, from a local government standpoint, I think you have to listen to what a developer says. And as an example, I have a real-life scenario that I'm working on where we had planned an office building component on a 56-acre site that we were doing about 400 housing units, 28,000 square foot retail center, and then about 200,000 square feet of office. We started the project in 2002. I represented the seller. The market changed. There's no office component needed because there's too much vacancy in the area to begin with. This is a project in Howard County. And so, the developer who was going to do the office component, who was different than the developer that was doing the residential component, just backed away. And now the developer who's doing the residential component has picked up that site and said, well, maybe there's a different type of residential need here as opposed to an office need. In 2002, the market was very hot for office, and so the developer was willing to pay a lot of money to be an office developer on that particular site. I think that you have to always be amendable and flexible to what a developer says. The market has passed me. It just takes too long to get this project done or that project done.
I appreciate that perspective. Thank you. Thank you, Mayor.
Mr. Ray?
I wasn't wanting to assume anything, Mr. Mayor. Thank you for the presentation. It is interesting, and actually, I hope we don't go backwards to the medieval times. I hope the economy's not heading that way, and society's not heading that way. And I have been in Europe and lived over there some, so I'm familiar with that aspect. And it grew up that way based upon a strong need of self-defense more than anything else, protection of the community from outside threats. So it made sense to centralize everything and put strong walls around the perimeter in order to provide protection from Visigoths and otherwise coming in. So it made sense. Now we've come a long way. And are you familiar with the Melford site?
You heard of the Maryland Science and Technology Center?
What used to be the University of Maryland Science and Technology Center?
Yes, sir.
You are familiar with it, and the history and what have you? And
not so much the history. I've been on the property a couple of times.
Okay.
I've never had any particular business, either professional or otherwise.
Mm-hmm. Is up until recently, it was long-term zoned. For a long time, it was zoned EIA. That's what it started out when it was back when it was Science and Tech. It's only in the most recent master plan that it was changed. Do you have any knowledge or information about EIAs and success of that? So you really can't comment on whether it's a failed plan, what was there, versus the possibilities of what an MXT could provide?
No, I can't comment.
Okay. You highlighted several, and National Harbor is a very good example of a well-planned, well-thought-out mixed-use development that had all the components. But all of that was settled before the first shovel of dirt was turned.
Right.
Whereas here we've got a site that is essentially half developed with a lot of flex and a couple of office buildings, a hoped for three hotel site. The question is what is proposed from the residential aspect? Does it fit well over there? Is it needed to complement it? We're told it is, and we're asked to trust the developer, and I'm willing to give him deference, but I'm skeptical, if you will. So have you ever had any experience with sites that have been half developed one way and then completely changed the direction that they're going and do an MXT?
Yeah, an example that I can tell you would be the Rouse Company, and Jim Rouse in particular, sold a large site that's now called Columbia Gateway.
Right.
He sold that site to General Electric, and it was going to be the General Electric Science Technology Park, where they were actually going to build all of the white goods that GE made for the whole country. And very quickly they realized that they couldn't compete labor-wise with East Coast labor compared to labor elsewhere. And they relocated that facility after the first two buildings were up. They relocated it to Kentucky, just because of labor. The site then became, over another 20-plus years, lots of different things. It became a hotel area, but it also became lots of corporate headquarters and offices and flex buildings, and finally 4 or 5 different developers in there building over 1,100 acres. So yeah, the project changed completely from where it originally had started. The last two buildings, let me rephrase, the first two buildings that General Electric built had to be retrofitted into office buildings because they were built as manufacturing facilities.
Mm-hmm. Just a side comment on the Towson site. It might have failed because the students were actually studying instead of going to the movies. So one can only hope that it's true.
As an alumnus of Towson, I doubt it. But
my wife's first career was as alumnus from Towson. Are there any drawbacks to MXTs? I mean, you've kind of sung the praise of it, but are there drawbacks?
Yeah. The drawbacks are when they're built with one particular component weighted too heavily against any other component. So there's too much housing, there's too much office, there's too much retail. That's the negative, where it's out of balance. It has to be in balance in order to work properly.
What determines balance?
I think market conditions.
Okay.
That there's a reason that you want to have an office building, not because government says there should be an office building, because there's a market for it. There's a reason they should have housing, not because the land is cheap and I can make a lot of money on it, but people would actually want to live there. And the road network certainly helps. From a retail standpoint, what type of retailers, and that's not something the government would ever tell you, but from a tenant mix, what type of retailers are going to go there.
Okay. No one has mentioned it, and you didn't include it in your discussions, but what about the inclusion of senior housing as a specific use within the residential component in mixed use?
There's two ways of looking at senior housing. And I'll try to keep this brief, but senior housing is a really big issue with me. If you're doing a senior housing component, meaning that it's a congregate care type facility, there's a reason for a congregate care type facility.
Thank you.
There's a reason for someone who's senior to live there. Because there's amenities, because there's doctor's offices, because there's a lot of things that seniors want, then I think it makes sense. Too often, though, people do senior housing because there's not school capacity. And I think that's a horrible reason to build senior housing, is that not having school capacity does not make someone have a successful senior housing project. Seniors want specific things. And so my personal issue has always been, if you're going to do a senior housing project, you need to build a leisure world. You need to build a reason that someone's going to be there. In Anne Arundel County, and maybe in Prince George's and other places, what we saw in the heyday was a school district would be locked out to a builder, and a perfectly good market rate site all of a sudden became a senior housing site solely for the reason that there wasn't school capacity, and the guy wanted to shove the project through the subdivision process. That's just a horrible reason to build. But if you have the amenities and you have a serious reason to do senior housing, by all means, it's a very good, useful way of developing a site. Not completely, but as a component.
Is the listing of the amenities that ought to be included out there? Is it common knowledge, or where can we go to find out?
Urban Land Institute, which is based in D.C.
Okay. All right.
And The easiest component is it's close to a hospital, it's close to doctor's offices, and it's a walkable area that people can enjoy themselves.
Okay. Yeah, that leads me into the next question. You referenced pedestrian friendly.
Yes.
Are you, the Science and Tech Center or the Melford Center basically is completely surrounded, it's landlocked, if you will. Mm-hmm. 2 interstate quality highways, south and west, and then in a southeast and northwest, the river runs along it, so it's pretty much landlocked. Mm-hmm. Is that still something that would present itself as pedestrian friendly? Internally, it can be made pedestrian friendly. I'm assuming. What you're looking for is not that the greater geographic area is pedestrian friendly, but the subject property is pedestrian friendly. You could do a 56-acre site pedestrian friendly. Right. You could do a 400-acre site pedestrian friendly. I mean, typically, when you're in the hundreds of acres, it's hard to make it pedestrian friendly because it's too big to walk. But what you're looking for is a very dense site that once someone arrives at that property, that is pedestrian friendly. Right. And I'm struck by your comment relative to, I guess you referenced the zip cars and how people are going to have cars, you have to provide for them.
Yes.
In this situation, with the exception of some small amenities that they're talking about, local, almost everyone that lives there are going to have to leave the site in order to do their major shopping. Mm-hmm. So it really doesn't, from a macro sense, if you will, it's not a pedestrian-friendly site. Internally it is, but not getting out.
Right.
And you've got a mall, you've got shopping just on the other side of the interchange, but there's no way they can walk to it. So it doesn't seem to be conducive in that sense. I had one more question, but I can't think of it. But again, I do thank you for this. It is informative. I guess of the 7 of us, I'm the lone skeptic on this.
Sure.
I'm not convinced that the site has failed. The biggest argument we get from the current property owner is the long history. It's been there since the early 80s and has never gone forward. But if you look at the history, it never moved forward because basically not the vision was wrong in my mind, but rather the owners couldn't agree and work amongst themselves, and it floundered for so long. And then the most recent problem, I think, with trying to move forward is the hit of the economy. And everyone's suffering from the economy right now. So, but the information you presented is very helpful, and I'll factor it in as I make my decision in 2 weeks on what to do. But thank you very much for that. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you, Dr. Trout. And then Mr. Marcos.
Thank you, Mr.